It's 5 in the morning in a Yorkshire pit village sometime in the early 1980s. A siren sounds across the rooftops, and within minutes the streets fill with men in flat caps and donkey jackets walking the same route they've walked their whole working lives. Down at the pit head, the cage is already waiting to take the next shift underground. Lamps are checked. Names are ticked off a board by the shaft. Nobody says much this early. This wasn't just a job. It was the entire reason the town existed at all. Every street, every school, every chapel had been built around that one pit. Almost everyone in it either worked down there or loved someone who did. Within a generation, almost all of it would be gone. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what these towns actually were. A colliery village wasn't simply a place where people happened to work in coal. The pit built the houses. The pit built the social clubs, the brass bands, the football teams, and the working men's institutes where families spent their evenings together. Even the local doctor and the corner shop often depended on the wages that came up out of the ground every single week. Entire generations of the same family worked the same seams, often going down the same shafts their fathers and grandfathers had gone down before them. A father might walk his own son to his first day at the same pit gates he'd walked through himself 30 years earlier. When a mine employed 400 men in a town of a few thousand people, it didn't just provide wages, it provided identity. Being a miner meant something specific and shared. A pride built on genuinely dangerous, physically brutal work, done alongside men you'd known your entire life. Men who had grown up on the same streets, gone to the same schools. Men who would go down the same cage together every single morning without fail, trusting each other completely with their own safety hundreds of feet underground. That closeness forged underground in the dark is something almost impossible to recreate once it's gone for good. By the 1980s, Britain's coal industry was genuinely in decline, and the reasons for that decline are still argued over today. Many pits had become harder and more expensive to work as the most accessible coal was gradually used up over the previous century. Cheaper alternatives like North Sea gas and imported coal became more readily available around the same time. On paper, some of the industry's economic arguments for closure were entirely real. Even sympathetic historians accept that not every pit could realistically have stayed open forever, regardless of politics. But the miners themselves believed something else was happening alongside the economics. The National Union of Mine Workers argued that pits with genuinely worthwhile coal reserves were being marked for closure, regardless of how much coal was actually still down there. There was said to be a secret list of more than 70 pits scheduled to shut. That claim was dismissed at the time by those in power. It was later shown to be entirely true. For many mining families, the closures felt less like sound economic housekeeping. They felt more like a deliberate attempt to break the power of their union once and for all, whatever the official reasoning given at the time might have been. On the 6th of March, 1984, miners at a South Yorkshire colliery learned their pit was to close, and they walked out. Within days, the strike had spread across Yorkshire and beyond. By the 12th of March, it had been declared a national strike across the whole country. Over the following year, roughly 140,000 of Britain's 187,000 working miners took part, walking away from their wages with no certainty of when or whether they'd ever be paid again. It became the most divisive industrial dispute in post-war British history. Picket lines turned into genuine flashpoints with thousands of police officers drafted in from across the country. Real violence broke out on more than one occasion. Images of it filled the news for months on end. Behind the picket lines, though, mining communities held together in ways that deserved to be remembered entirely on their own terms. Wives, sisters, and daughters organized soup kitchens and support groups that fed entire villages for months on end, often stretching a single week's food across families who had no wages coming in at all. Children still had shoes on their feet and food on the table because of the sheer determination of the women running those kitchens week after week. Communities in Yorkshire, South Wales, Scotland, and Kent held the strike the longest and hardest, standing by each other through a full year with no pay and no certainty of ever going back underground at all. The strike ended on the 3rd of March 1985, without the victory the miners had fought a full year for. Men walked back through the same pit gates they'd walked out of 12 months earlier, heads held high behind brass bands even in defeat. Some communities marched back to work together as one, refusing to let a year of hardship be the last word on who they were. The pit closures that the union had gone on strike to prevent went ahead regardless and then accelerated sharply. By 1994, when what remained of the industry was privatized, only 15 deep mines were still working in the whole of Britain, down from well over 100 just a decade earlier. The last deep coal mine in the country finally closed in 2015, bringing centuries of British deep coal mining to an end completely. The miners themselves had a slogan during those closures that turned out to be devastatingly accurate. Close a pit, kill a community. It wasn't an exaggeration or a rhetorical flourish dreamed up for a placard. It was in town after town, almost exactly what happened in the years that followed. When a colliery closed in a town built entirely around it, local unemployment could climb past 50% almost overnight. There was rarely anything else nearby for a miner's specific skills to transfer into. Entire towns that had known full employment for generations were suddenly left with nothing at all to replace it. Unemployment in former coalfield areas stayed stubbornly high for decades afterward, long after the same figures had recovered almost everywhere else in the country. The damage went far beyond lost wages alone. Former mining communities saw rising poverty, worsening health, and social problems, including drug use, take hold in places that had never known them before the pits closed. A sense of being quietly left behind by the rest of the country settled over these towns. For many people who lived through it, that feeling has genuinely never lifted even now. It wasn't only the miners who lost their livelihoods that year, it was their children too, and in some towns, their children's children as well. Growing up in places where the one thing everyone had once been proud of simply wasn't there anymore, replaced instead by empty pit yards slowly being reclaimed by grass. Job centers in these towns stayed busy for decades, in a way they simply hadn't needed to be before. Young people who might once have followed their fathers underground grew up instead with far fewer choices about what their own working life might actually look like. Drive through some of these towns now, and the pit itself is often long gone entirely. The winding gear either scrapped for metal or preserved as a lone monument, standing in an otherwise empty field. A handful of the old buildings sometimes survive as small local museums, carefully keeping alive a way of life that the town around them can no longer actually offer anyone at all. The social clubs and brass bands that the pit once funded and organized often struggled on for years afterward, run increasingly by volunteers, determined not to let the last piece of that identity disappear along with the jobs themselves. Some of those bands are still playing today, carrying a name and a tradition from a pit that closed decades before most of their current members were even born. For the people who actually lived through it, the pit was never simply a workplace waiting to be replaced by something else on a spreadsheet. It was a whole way of belonging to something bigger than yourself. That's exactly what makes its loss still felt so sharply even decades later. In towns that most of the rest of the country barely thinks about at all anymore, unless a headline happens to mention them. The pits are gone now, and so are most of the men who worked them. But the pride those communities carried, the closeness built underground, the sacrifice made on those picket lines, all of it deserves to be remembered honestly, not just as a footnote in someone else's political story, told by people who never had to worry about where their own next wage was coming from. If your family came from a mining town, you already know that pride never really left, even after the pits themselves did.